when I play a video, you can kind of capture it integrity, but it samples it. So what you get is, I mean, the regular video is smooth, what happens in the classroom. But when you play a video, you get smooth audio, but the video is sampled, so you get like snapshots, and the people look like robots. But anyway, but it captures some of the information. So anyway, back to Aristophanes. So Aristophanes was doing much like, say, Saturday Night Live or in Living Color, when they do skits. You know, he would take shots at famous people in Greek society or the powerful, and Socrates was famous by this time. So he wrote a play called The Clouds, and this is a scene from that play. You get a little quote in your book where Socrates is supposed to have done, a stupid thing like measure a flea's foot, to put, shoes on it. But I think this illustrates Socrates as a nature philosopher a little bit better. So I'm going to pass around a little bit because I want to kind of get through things. Sometimes I'll call the roll and pass it around. Sometimes I just kind of pass one around. Okay, so at any rate, here's a selection from The Clouds. And then they talk a little bit about the nature philosophers. And then they show you a different portrayal of Socrates, one from Plato's early dialogue, the Meno, where you probably get a much more accurate picture of Socrates. So you can compare the two. In the first, Socrates is not only portrayed as a nature philosopher, but as kind of a bumbling fool. And the second one is much closer to how he probably really was in real life. So let me just play this selection. It's about 10 or 15 minutes.
The Greeks based many of their religious beliefs on the great poems of Hesiod and Homer. How far did they see them as their Bible?
I think Bible would be a misleading comparison. You see, the Greeks had the idea that knowledge was put into the mind of the poet by the Muses, that the poet was inspired. The difficulty was to know which poets were inspired or how often. Now, Hesiod tells a story about his own meeting with the Muses in a lonely place. They gave him the gift of poetry, and they said to him, "We know how to tell fiction which resembles truth, and we know also how to proclaim the truth when we wish."
Many of us are puzzled that the legends contradict one another. Which versions did the Greeks believe?
It's really a question of what responded to the needs of any particular community or individual. And they were accustomed always, from the beginning, to the fact that poets don't agree in telling legends. For example, in Hesiod, the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love, she is born from the genitals of the sky god when they're cut off by his son and they fall into the sea. Now in Homer, Aphrodite has a much more straightforward parentage. Now when two poets tell different stories that are irreconcilable, they may both be wrong, but the one thing you can be sure of is they can't both be right. And the Greeks absolutely accepted this situation. Because they didn't have an idea of orthodox belief about the past. Consequently, they didn't have any persecution of people for what they believed or didn't believe about the past. And one result of that was that they were free to talk about creation if they wished, in quite different terms, cutting out gods and persons altogether.
Very good point. That's from the time
Perhaps for the first time, about things and substances.
The first living creatures,
And that's man.
fish, or creatures like fish, were generated in water from a warming of water and earth. They were encased in spiny coverings. Within these creatures, human beings formed and were retained as fetuses until maturity. Then the fish-like creatures came out onto drier ground. The covering burst, and men and women came forth, capable of feeding themselves.
One short step took them a very long way. Because once you ask, how did things begin? And you answer that question not in terms of gods and persons, but in terms of the nature of things. And then you switch from the past tenses to the present. And you ask, how do things work now? And straight away, you're talking physics.
Everyone has the wrong conception of coming into being and perishing. For nothing comes into being, nor does it perish, but it is put together from things already existing and taken apart again. So they ought to speak of being taken apart instead of perishing.
That's the kind of thing that the Greek philosophers said, which may be right or wrong, it may be wise or silly, but at least it is a scientific statement because it is about how things work. It's armchair science, of course. It's speculation. It's not experiment. But it's still a statement of a scientific type rather than a statement of a religious type, a statement of myth.
The fact that those brilliant Greeks didn't apply their science, weren't interested in engineering and so on, has given many of us the idea that there was grey-beard philosophers to a man going about with their heads in the clouds.
Very few Greeks were philosophers. Most Greeks were farmers. And in the classical period, to call a man a philosopher was very often a joke or an insult. And what the man in the street thought about philosophy and scientific speculation is very well shown up in comedy, particularly in the picture Aristophanes gives us in Clouds of Socrates as a thinker.
Zeus! What rubbish! There's no Zeus!
That's supposed to be
Well,
Socrates.
who makes the rain aim? We don't have a star. The clouds do, of course. I explain. The evidence is overwhelming. Have you ever seen rain without clouds? But on your theory, it ought to rain out of a clear sky with no clouds in sight. That certainly fits in with what you're saying. But you know, honestly, I always thought that Zeus was fizzing through a sieve. But tell me, who does the thundering? That's what gives me the willies. They thunder in random motion. So give me some ideas, but what do you mean? When they are charged with fluid, and the laws of physics set them in motion, they hang low, laden with rain. Through the laws of physics, and then laden, they collide and hit.
So it's explaining how we get the rain and the gods.
About thunder. Think that in, when the clouds are filled with water, they collide and produce a noise by virtue of their density. What reason do you have for thinking that? I explain. With reference to your own experience. Have you ever filled yourself up with stew at a festival, and then felt a bit funny in your belly? When a rumbling and bubbling runs all through it. By God, I am, and it certainly gives me trouble when it's upset, and that bit of stew starts thundering. Makes a terrible noise. Quite like at first, the sort of a... And it steps up a bit. And when I go for a shit, thunder! It's like the clouds. Well, just think what a fart you can produce from that big belly of yours. And doesn't it stand to reason there above us could do a great
It's good racy knockabout stuff, that sea, isn't it?
Yes, and the strange thing is that to judge by all the other evidence we've got about Socrates, things like the weather, astronomy, physics, science generally, were among the many, many things in which he wasn't in the least interested. He belonged in the tradition that began with Xenophanes, the tradition which focused its attention on the question, how should we live?
Greek ideas. It was Greek minds, the good sense they taught, Greek nous, another word we've taken from them, their word for mind, that brought us back to the stone quarries of Syracuse. 100 years before Socrates, the philosopher Xenophanes lived here in Syracuse.
A combination of earth and sea periodically occurs, and in time they are separated by the liquid collecting. Proof of this is that seashells are found inland and on mountains. At Syracuse, in the quarries, the imprint of a fish has been found, and on Paris, the imprint of a laurel deep in the marble, and on Malta, impressions of all the creatures of the sea. This happened when everything was mud, long ago, and the imprint dried out in the mud.
Xenophanes stayed in Syracuse, but he didn't come from here.
No, he actually came from a Greek city on the far side of the Aegean, but when that part of the world was under pressure from the Persians, he came over here and spent most of his life in Sicily. Now, it's an interesting thing, when you see a fossil fish or a shell in a quarry, there's three ways you can react. You can say, isn't it funny, that rock looks like a shell? Or you can say, it's miraculous, God has planted a shell in the rock. Or you can say, well now, I wonder. And that's what Xenophanes said. And it led him to the notion that the distribution of land and sea may not always have been what it is now. Xenophanes was very hostile to myth, and particularly he didn't like myths about conflict in the supernatural world, battles between gods and giants, gods and titans, and so on. And curiously enough, just at the time when he was saying that, precisely that theme of the battle of the gods and giants was being used by sculptors for the marvellous sculpture on the Siphonian treasury at Delphi. Xenophanes very much wanted to believe in gods or a god entirely good, and certainly infinitely better than man. And the myths that he inherited in Persia, of course, represented the gods as behaving very badly. And this is why he simply threw the whole of myth out the window. He referred to it scornfully on one occasion as fictions of our forebears.
Bold words. In Greek legend, Hephaestus, the mighty armourer of the gods, had his forge in the heart of a volcano, Mount Etna in Sicily, just 30 miles from Syracuse. And the great temple dedicated to Hephaestus in the marketplace of Athens gives some sense of the awe and veneration in which many Greeks held their gods. But Xenophanes, in the 6th century BC, was free to speculate about the origins of the universe, and free to describe the gods as fiction. Greek minds. Socrates, the most famous Greek philosopher of all, didn't believe in the rowdy, bawdy gods of Mount Olympus either. But in one of Plato's great dialogues, he sets out, with a young boy, to use a lesson in mathematics as proof that man isn't just a material being, that a God exists, and we all have souls.
How many figures of that size are there in this square?
4.
Now, how many in this square?
2.
What is 4 in relation to 2?
It's twice as much.
Now, on what line was this figure constructed?
This one?
The one that stretches from corner to corner of this square.
Yes.
One of professions called the diagonal. So if diagonal is its name, what you're saying is that if you start with a square and want to make one twice as big, you make it on the diagonal?
Yes, that's just it, Socrates.
Well, Meno, what do you think? Did he answer with any single opinion that wasn't his own?
No, it was all his own.
But he didn't know me that long ago.
That's true.
But these opinions were in him, weren't they? Yes. So, when a man doesn't know, there are true opinions in him about things he doesn't know about. Looks like it. At the moment, these opinions have begun to be stirred up in him in a hazy sort of way. But if someone's prepared to ask him these same questions many times and in many ways, you realize that in the end he'll have as precise a knowledge of the subject as anyone.
Seems so.
And he'll have that knowledge without anyone having taught him. Only asking. He'll have recovered the knowledge out of himself.
Yes.
And recovering knowledge inside oneself, that's recollecting, isn't it?
Certain.
This knowledge he has now, either he was given it at some time, or he had it all the time.
Yes.
So, if he had it all the time, then he was knowledgeable all the time. But if he was given it on some occasion, he can't have been given it in his present life. Oh, Lord. Has this slave of yours been taught geometry? And he'll do the same as he did with anything in geometry and all other subjects. Has anyone taught him them all? You ought to know, considering he was born and brought up in your house.
I know very well that no one's ever taught him.
And has he got these opinions or not?
It looks as though he must have.
And if he hasn't,
Okay, now there's some problem with the video, but this was about where I was going to stop it anyway. So what's going on here? Who's Socrates discussing things with? And it may not seem that this story relates to the allegory of the cave, but it actually does. Who's the boy? Is he Meno's son? He's Meno's slave, right. Why do you think that in this dialogue they have Socrates discussing things with Meno's slave boy rather than somebody's son? Of course, in ancient Greek society, like a lot of ancient societies, slavery, unlike today, was looked upon as an acceptable practice. Okay. Do you think that slaves were given the same kind of education that, a wealthy Greek's child would have been given? Not real, right? And this is the point here. There's no public education system in ancient Greece. You can't be the son of a carpenter like I was, but nonetheless learn geometry because there's a public education system and you went to Polytechnic, which is paid for by taxpayer dollars. So the idea is this boy has not had a formal education, not been taught geometry. And what is Socrates doing? Do you think he's supposed to be teaching the boy geometry here? The answer is not really. Now, again, we can disagree with Plato, but if we were to go with Plato's version of what's going on here, Socrates is just asking the boy questions. Now, this is how this story relates to the allegory of the cave that we saw last time. Remember, Plato thinks that there are some eternally true things, like the basic principles of geometry and mathematics. And these truths he portrays as real knowledge, and that's what's going on outside the cave. But Plato and Socrates' view was that our souls, that reincarnation is true, and that our souls can be reincarnated, and that before they were incarnated in this present body, our souls knew some of these eternal truths. But so shocking is it to become incarnated in a body that a lot of this knowledge is knocked into a latent state. So Socrates and Plato both argue that you can bring it to the surface by asking questions. And so that's part of what's going on there. And Socrates is supposed to say, well, look, if this guy has never been taught geometry and yet he's answering my questions right, how can that be? Well, Socrates' answer to this is he can answer them right because his soul, because this is evidence that his soul pre-existed its present body. Now, is that the only explanation for what's going on there? Not really, right? I mean, we could say, well, why couldn't he just be reasoning out things from the diagram? Stuff like that. But for Socrates and Plato, that's the best and really the only real explanation they focus on. And Socrates uses this to argue for the immortality of the soul, that it pre-existed this present body and is going to go on to exist. So he believes in an afterlife. And that's part of what was meant by what we call the Socratic method. Now, when teachers today use the, quote, Socratic method, a lot of what they're talking about is they might be asking you questions about the homework assignment that you were supposed to have read the night before, right? But the real Socratic method here presupposed that our soul has latent knowledge that can be brought to the surface by questioning. And that's what Socrates did in Athens. He questioned people, and he also tried to show people some false beliefs that they had, which is something we'll look at next time. So that's some of what was going on there. How is Socrates portrayed as kind of a nature philosopher in that first video? What is he supposedly explaining to his friend? And you can see the portraits are very different, right? Socrates is kind of the bumbling idiot in the first one, right? I mean, he's supposed to be explaining what really makes the rain, right? And I know it goes by real quickly, but one of the things that he says at the beginning of this is Zeus, there's no Zeus. Socrates is portraying as denying the existence of the gods, a charge which, by the way, Socrates responded to by saying that he does believe to a certain extent in the gods, some of the gods. But, and notice he's trying to get out a naturalistic explanation for why it rains, that it's wrong, but it refers to nothing but forces in nature, the clouds, colliding and producing thunder and producing the rain. Folks, it's a lot louder than I think. These rooms are so even with the acoustic tile, sound travels so much. In past semesters, I get people in front, complaining that they can't hear because people are talking in the back. So I'm not singling somebody out specifically. But so anyway, so you can see how Aristophanes is kind of portraying Socrates as a nature philosopher who wants to cut the gods out of the picture. I want to sort of transition to a little bit of this selection that you find from the dialogue, the Crito, and the scene of the Crito is after Socrates has been convicted and sentenced to death. Now, in ancient Greece, normally something like a death sentence was carried out in a few days. You don't get 10 years of appeals. It did not happen in Socrates' case that way. And the reason it didn't was about the same time he was sentenced, the priests were making a voyage by ship to an island called Delos, that's where supposedly some of the gods were born, to make an offering to the gods. So there was a ceremony, a religious ceremony that began about the time Socrates was sentenced, and it took about a month for the ship to make this journey. Now, how does that relate to a delay in Socrates' execution? Well, the thought was that during this religious time, people in Athens should be ritually pure. And the thought was they would harm their ritual purity by allowing executions to take place in the city during this holy time. So Socrates had about a month where, even though he was imprisoned, he could be visited by friends, followers, and his family. And that's what's happening at the Crito. Now, Meno is a good example of the kinds of people who Socrates had as followers.
After all, it's obvious that at any time either he is a human or he isn't.
Get the
Then if the truth of reality
part of this.
is always in our souls,
See, the truth of reality is always in us.
must be immortal. So that whatever we
Okay. Well, he says whatever we recollect. The idea is that we're really recollecting things when we think we're learning things. But to get back to this, Meno is typical of the sort of person who Socrates had as followers. If you are the son of a farmer, and you have to get up at daybreak to help your parents run the farm and work in the fields and feed the animals, do you think you have a lot of time on your hands to go follow Socrates around Athens and listen to him question people philosophically? Not hardly, right? And if you're the son of a carpenter or a shopkeeper, and you have to help your parents run the shop, you think you have much time for philosophy? Not really. Who did have time to follow Socrates around Athens? Well, basically, children of means, children whose parents were wealthy or who were young and successful themselves and had some wealth. So Socrates followers, many of them, are fairly wealthy, even though Socrates is not at this point. He makes a point at his trial to say he hasn't been charging a fee for his teaching like the sophists, the paid teachers, did. So Socrates is in prison, and his friends come to him with a plan. They will bribe the guards and get them to allow Socrates to escape. And they already have a friend in the island of in the city of Thessaly, where Socrates can go and live in exile. And his friends, again, there's a selection in your book by this, but this is built around. I used to have people read the whole dialogue. I haven't done that for many years. But you have a long selection from this dialogue. Crito is one of Socrates' young followers, and he's the one who proposes this plan to Socrates. And he makes the point that, look, this is not going to set us back monetarily, Socrates. You're not going to harm us financially. We have enough money to do this. And Crito says he's got friends in Thessaly at the top of this that'll put Socrates up. And Socrates is 70 years old at the time of his trial and execution. But he's not a hermit, and he's not a recluse. He actually has a young wife who's more than 20 years younger and some kind of middle school aged sons. And so one of the arguments that Crito makes is, well, don't you want to be around to help see that your sons are brought up right and educated properly? And also, Socrates was a pretty macho guy. He was a real in-your-face guy. He was a soldier in the Peloponnesian War. And so they appeal to Socrates' macho character, and they say, hey, you don't want people to think that you were cowardly or unmanly. You don't want people to think you were a wimp because you were afraid to try to escape. And a point he also makes, and I'm not going to go into it all, but Crito says, hey, think of what people are going to think of us when you're gone. They're going to say, hey, you know what? His friends had the means. Some friends they could have tried to get him out of prison, and they didn't do it. Socrates says, think about public opinion for yourself. You don't want people to think you are a coward or a wimp. And think about public opinion as regards to us. What are people going to think of us? Now, Socrates did believe in an afterlife. And he believed that what we do now affects what's going to happen to us in the afterlife. And so it's important for Socrates to do the right thing. And what we get is a moral argument from Socrates where he weighs whether or not accepting his friend's offer is the right thing to do. So Socrates says, look, here's what my argument ought to rest on. Which argument seems best? In other words, what can I make the best philosophical and moral case for? Accepting your offer to escape or staying here and allow the sentence to be executed. And so, again, Crito makes this argument about the opinions of men. And what Socrates does is respond to this by saying, well, look, consider an Olympic athlete. Is an Olympic athlete going to listen to the opinion of the everyday man on the street who might say, hey, eat a cheeseburger or two? You know, don't worry about what your trainer says. Or are they going to listen to the expert, to the trainer? And the thought, the implication here is that who's the expert, who's the trainer when it comes to things in philosophy and moral arguments? Well, it's Socrates. And Socrates says, I'm not worried about the opinion of the man on the street. I'm not worried about public opinion. I'm not going to make and take an opinion poll or get a focus group together to figure out what I ought to do here. You know, but I'm going to look at the moral case that can be provided one way or another. And that's what he does. And this is one of the first examples of ethical reasoning. And one ethics text I used to use this as an example of how applied ethics is done even today by bringing in general moral principles and particular facts relating to a situation you're thinking about and deciding whether that principle applies to this situation. And that's basically what Socrates does. And we're going to look more about this reasoning next time. So Socrates says, I'm more interested in reasoning. And here in the middle of this, Socrates says, look, the most important thing to me is not just life, not just hanging on to life at any cost, but the good life. Again, whether you agree with him or not, he thinks that what's going to happen in the afterlife to him is going to depend in part on this decision, whether he does the right thing or not. So he says, you know, the important thing then is the good life. So, and so along that line, in the first sentence here, he says, for Socrates, the only valid consideration is whether he and his friends would be acting rightly in giving money to others to facilitate his escape. And so they bring in the first moral principle that they're going to discuss, that we oughtn't to harm an innocent person. And even if we're wrong, he says, we oughtn't to take vengeance on somebody. That person must never inflict wrong or injury in return, since to do so would be morally wrong. It would violate this general principle of not willingly doing wrong to somebody. And Socrates says, is this the view of the majority? And they say, no, they think you ought to take vengeance. So right, you know, Socrates is against majority opinion here anyway. But another principle they bring in that we're going to look at in a little more detail next time is Socrates asks Crito whether we ought to fulfill a contract or a just agreement or cheat on it. And Crito agrees that we have a moral obligation to live up to our contracts. Now we're going to see that he argues, so he says we should not break a just agreement. And so he's going to argue that he's got an understood agreement to obey the laws of Athens as a citizen of Athens. We'll look at that next time, but consider the first one. Socrates relates to the city of Athens much as if it were a person, almost as if it were a parent to him that oversaw him. And he says, what if the laws of Athens could talk? What would they say to me, knowing that I'm pondering over whether or not I should accept your offer to escape? And he says, what they would come and they would say, well, why are you trying to destroy us, Socrates? And here's the point. He says, because a city and its laws would be destroyed if the verdicts of its courts were to be overturned at will by private individuals. You know. So he would be entering the city and he would be going back on the verdict of the courts by escaping. Now, this might not have been the case. At Socrates' trial, I'm just going to give you this as background, there were actually 500 people in the jury. To be more exact, 501, so there could not be a tie. So 500 ordinary people had to vote on his guilt or innocence, and the vote was very close. But the charges against Socrates were things like corrupting the youth of Athens by leading them after other gods, or by teaching them to be atheists, being a nature philosopher, studying things in the sky and under the earth, being a very slick reasoner, making what it should be a bad position look like a good position. These were not things where there was a penalty on the books, okay? Now, in Greek law, where there was no penalty, but somebody was convicted of that type of an offense, the way the law provided for fairness here was that there would be a second vote of the jury in what was called the penalty, what we would call a penalty phase. And the prosecutor would get to propose a penalty, and the accused, or somebody representing the accused, their attorney, would propose a counter penalty, and fairness was achieved by the jury would vote which one to accept. So you say, the prosecutors chose death. Socrates could have chosen exile, but he didn't. Socrates says, look, these are trumped up charges. I'm being convicted on something unjustly. He says, you want me to propose a penalty? Socrates was his own lawyer. He says, I'm not going to propose a penalty because I don't think I deserve it. He says, you want a penalty? Here's a penalty. We have an elaborate state dining hall where the Olympic athletes are honored, and where the big political bigwigs get to eat for free at the city's expense. What I'm doing is so valuable in challenging people philosophically. Give me a pension for life, so I can continue doing this, and in the elaborate state dining hall. Now, does that sound like a penalty? It's not. The jury did not have a choice. They didn't have a real choice. They had only one real penalty, and so they voted for the death penalty. The point is, had the jury voted for exile, if Socrates had proposed exile, then he could have left, gone into exile. The court system would have worked. With the city's blessing, he could have gone into exile. But now, he would be going against what was decided in the court system and undermining it by accepting his friend's offer and going into exile. So anyway, we'll look a little bit more about that. Read the Crito selection either in supplementary readings or in your text, and also Dr. King's letter, and we'll try to get through both of those next time. Thanks a lot. And somebody during the roll up, and anybody, if you didn't get to it, make sure you sign it.